December 16th, 1773, Boston. A cold, steady rain had turned the crooked streets into rivers of mud. By mid-afternoon, more than 5,000 people, nearly a third of the town, had crammed into the Old South Meeting House or packed the streets outside, the largest crowd the town had ever seen. They were waiting for Royal Governor Hutchinson's answer. The colonists demanded that 3 British ships sail away without unloading their cargo of tea. They refused to let that tea open the door to taxation without representation. At 6 o'clock, the governor's final answer came back. No. Near the front of the hall, a man rose. A 51-year-old Harvard man whose business ventures fell short and whose family money had slipped away. Financially, Samuel Adams was a failure. And yet, he was about to start a revolution. Adams had an unmatched talent for organizing ordinary men and setting ideas ablaze. When the room grew quiet, Samuel Adams spoke these famous words.
This meeting can do nothing more to save the country.
It was the signal. War whoops erupted. Men with faces blackened by coal dust surged towards the doors. What happened over the next 3 hours would ignite the American Revolution. This is the story of Samuel Adams. Hello there. I'm your host, Jacob, and you're listening to Stories of American Legends. It all began 8 years earlier. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, the first direct tax on the colonies. Every newspaper, every contract, even a deck of playing cards had to carry a paid British stamp. In Boston, 9 ordinary men refused to accept it. They weren't soldiers or rich merchants. They were tradesmen, distillers, printers, shopkeepers. They plotted in secret in the back room of a distillery and called themselves the Loyal 9. They knew that the tax could not work without one man, the royal stamp distributor, Andrew Oliver. On the morning of August 14th, 1765, Boston woke to find an effigy of Andrew Oliver hanging from a great elm. By nightfall, the Loyal 9 had a mob in the streets. The crowd tore down the building Oliver had planned to use as his stamp office and gutted his house. The next morning, Oliver resigned. The great elm where Oliver's effigy had hung became known as the Liberty Tree. For the next decade, it stood as the gathering place of Boston's resistance, where crowds came to hear speeches, hang effigies, and defy royal authority. The British never forgot what it meant. When they occupied Boston in 1775, soldiers cut it down and burned it for firewood. The Loyal 9 had started something. Resistance spread across the colonies, and chapters formed called the Sons of Liberty. But it was Samuel Adams who gave them purpose and direction. He understood that it was not just about one hated tax. It was about whether Parliament had any right to tax Americans without their consent. And he had the political skill, the connections, and the iron will to turn scattered protest into organized defiance. 2 years later, Parliament tried again with the Townshend Acts. New duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Boston answered with boycotts and violence against the customs men. The officials fled and declared the city ungovernable. So London sent the soldiers. By the fall of 1768, roughly 2,000 British regulars had moved into Boston and turned it into an occupied city. For 18 months, the British soldiers harassed the colonists. For 18 months, Samuel Adams went to work with his pen, writing essay after essay describing the outrages and stirring up resentment against the crown.
Will the spirits of the people, as yet unsubdued by tyranny, unawed by the menace of arbitrary power, submit to be governed by military force? No.
On March 5th, 1770, everything boiled over. Outside the Custom House on King Street, a crowd surrounded 8 British soldiers. Snowballs and chunks of frozen ice flew. Then rocks. Some angry colonists swung clubs at the redcoats. A British soldier got knocked down. He got up and fired his musket. The other British soldiers started firing too as chaos consumed King Street. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. Adams moved fast. He labeled it the Boston Massacre, and Paul Revere's engraving of British soldiers firing into a helpless crowd spread across the colonies, igniting more fury against the crown. The troops were pulled out of the city, and Parliament repealed the Townshend duties. All but one. London kept the tax on tea. This was a fatal mistake. And Adams was already thinking bigger. He proposed the creation of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, a standing network linking towns across Massachusetts. Through shared letters and resolutions, he was quietly building the infrastructure of resistance. Now we return to the ships loaded with tea. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver sat in Boston Harbor, loaded with East India Company tea. The tea still carried a tax that Parliament had imposed without the consent of the colonies. If the tea was unloaded and sold, it would mean the Americans had accepted Parliament's right to tax them. For 20 days, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty had demanded the ships leave with the tea still aboard. Hutchinson refused. On December 16, 1773, the royal governor gave his final response. The answer was no. Samuel Adams rose.
This meeting can do nothing more to save the country.
War whoops filled the hall. Men with blackened faces, roughly 150 of them, disguised as Mohawk warriors, marched to Griffin's Wharf. They boarded the 3 ships, ordered the crews below, and worked in near silence for 3 hours. They hauled up 342 chests, split them open, and dumped the tea into the harbor, 92,000 pounds of it. They touched nothing else. When one man tried to pocket some tea, they stripped his coat and sent him running. This was not a riot. It was a message. It was the point of no return. They knew London could not let this go unanswered. King George and Parliament were furious. They passed what became known as the Intolerable Acts, a series of harsh measures that closed Boston Harbor, stripped Massachusetts of its government, restricted town meetings, and sent more troops to the colony. London expected Boston to break and submit. Instead, the opposite happened. The colonies rallied. Food, money, and supplies poured in from across America. Instead of isolating Boston, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies in resistance. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. 6 months later, British troops marched out of Boston toward Lexington and Concord. Their orders were to seize colonial military supplies and arrest rebel leaders, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They never found them. Instead, Paul Revere rode through the night to sound the alarm. Militias turned out. What began as a British raid quickly turned into a running battle. By the end of that bloody day, the British were retreating under fire all the way back to Boston. After more than a decade of preparation, the storm Samuel Adams had helped gather finally broke, and the American Revolution had begun. In 1776, Samuel Adams was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He later served as a governor of Massachusetts. He lived long enough to see the nation he helped create survive its most fragile years. He died in 1803 at the age of 81 in his beloved Boston. He was never a general. he never led men into battle. But he understood something few others grasped at the time. A revolution would not begin in Parliament or on a battlefield. It would begin in the taverns, the print shops, and the streets, through ideas, organization, and persistence. Samuel Adams didn't just light the fuse. Over more than a decade, he helped build the powder keg. Through his writing, his meetings, and the network of correspondence, he played a pivotal role in turning 13 separate colonies into one people, ready to fight for their liberty. As he once wrote,
"For no people will tamely surrender their liberties, nor can any be easily subdued, when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved."
Samuel Adams wasn't just an agitator. He wasn't just a writer of fiery essays. He was an American legend. Thanks for listening to Stories of American Legends. If you like this story, follow me on X at History with Jacob. The handle is HistoryWJacob. I post stories from American history every day. And please, subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. It really helps. Next episode, the Over Mountain Men. Rugged frontiersmen who wanted to be left alone during the Revolutionary War. But when the overconfident British threatened to burn their homes and hang their leaders, these mountain warriors answered with fury and crushed the enemy at Kings Mountain. Don't miss it. But until then, stay legendary.